Every summer, thousands of holidaymakers flock here to the British seaside to enjoy the warm weather, the pebble beaches and the amusement arcades. But there's another side to these shores, a sinister underbelly of violence and murder, where sins are washed away in the tide and where the seafront is stalked by sadistic killers who, like the ocean itself, have no respect for human life. My name's Dr. Nell Darby. I've written extensively about the history of crime, researching the reasons why people kill. Over the course of my career, I've developed a keen eye for spotting trends in a killer's behaviour. Nowhere are these trends more striking than in the not-so-sunny seaside towns of Britain's coastline, which have always seemed to attract an extraordinarily high number of murderous rogues. In this series of Murder by the Sea, I examine a selection of chilling new cases, many of which have never been featured on television before. Join me on a journey to the cliff's edge, where the land meets the sea, and where life meets death. We're in Scotland today to explore the case of a female hiker who went missing in 1993 and the former soldier who hid what had happened to her for nearly a year.
You don't have many of this type of murder up in the Highlands.
He built her into a series of expectations and fantasies. The victim has no real knowledge of this. And then when something happens finally, it's a huge embarrassment and it then leads on to a killing.
This was the only thing that ever happened up there, and as serious as this.
Inverness in the Scottish Highlands is a mecca for hill walkers. It's just on the edge of Loch Duich, which is a sea loch. It's the most peaceful and beautiful surroundings, but rugged.
It's a beautiful place with mountains and lochs, and it's nice for a lot of them go for walking.
It is the stuff of calendars. It is picturesque beyond belief. And this is where Helen Talbot loved to spend her days and where she lost her life.
Helen's kind of an inspiration in some ways, in that she's a woman in her early 60s. She's married to a respected gynecologist, but she's still very independent. She loves walking, she likes keeping active, and so she takes herself off every year on her own to do these walking holidays.
She was a sophisticated character. She kept a very sort of tight diary. She monitored her own activities. She loved the outdoors. She liked exercise.
And what I know, she was a very nice person. Good family, very contented family. She was right into hill walking and naming hills. The Grahams, which is her maiden name. I think there's over 200 of them now.
With the co-designer, they identified all the hills or mountains in Scotland between 2,000 and 2,500 feet, and they're known as Grahams. The ones over 3,000 feet are known as the Monroes, and they're probably more famous. But she was heavily involved in the hill walking community as such, and the major force in that. She contributed a lot to society.
In July 1993, Helen set off to go hiking across the hills. She'd been going to the area since the 1980s, the late 1980s, and she usually stayed in the same guest house, Griannan House, a B&B, nestled at the edge of Loch Duich. It was run by a couple called Donald and Zena MacMillan and their son, who was also called Donald Jnr. MacMillan.
This was her 6th visit to this particular guest house, so she was very at home there. She felt it was a home from home. All the MacMillans knew Helen well because she was a regular visitor, so in a sense she was part of the family every year. You know, she would come and establish herself at the guest house.
Donald MacMillan Jr. was a strange and solitary character. He had oddish relations with others. He seemed to lack social insight into situations. You know, he lacked that kind of social sophistication that most people just becomes natural.
He'd left school without any qualifications, had worked occasionally, and had then joined the army. And he'd served in Northern Ireland and elsewhere overseas, but his army career had been somewhat undistinguished. In fact, he had deserted, had been caught and sentenced to the Glass House military prison for a lengthy period. When he came home, he helped his mother and father run Crianan House.
He lives in a caravan, so it's given him some independence, but on the other hand, it's not necessarily the place that he's going to be able to attract females or friends to come round, and from what we gather, he didn't have many visitors or anything like that.
He was known as a bit of a weirdo. He'd never seemed able to maintain relationships with any of the local women, and he always seemed a bit off.
Donald MacMillan's essential kind of schizoid character would mean that he'd be very happy living in a caravan, distant from others, not socially interacting with anybody within his own household, or in fact having any amenable neighbours. So that kind of social isolation would kind of amplify his schizoid character. He would be somebody who would be completely de-skilled when it comes to having any social insight into other people.
You know, this is a guy who'd been to Germany with the army, Northern Ireland with the army, had done time in the Glass House. You would have thought he'd want something a bit more exciting than bed and breakfast up in the Highlands of Scotland.
Being kind of socially distant, Donald MacMillan would have been someone who would need to kind of know someone bit by bit to feel kind of comfortable with them. And Helen Talbot was a regular visitor to his parents' B&B. So he would have become familiar with her. She would have seemed to be more accessible. She would have been kind of chivalrous and reasonable with him, which is kind of like, for somebody like Donald, it would be a come-on.
In the summer of 1993, Donald MacMillan Jr. was left in sole charge of the guest house while his parents were away.
They'd been away for that weekend because a relation of, I think it was his father, the funeral was on the Friday, away down in Aberdeenshire. So they were away. But Mrs. Talbot was there on her own with Donald.
On the evening of July the 6th, 1993, Donald Jr. was very definitely living in the guest house itself. And we know that because the caravan was occupied by relatives who'd come to spend a few days and to celebrate their wedding anniversary. So on that night, Donald Jr. is just a few doors down from Helen Talbot.
We know he was kind of sexually interested in older women. He had that kind of fetish, if you like. So Helen, to him, represented this kind of fantasy figure almost.
It's likely that he got to know her at a superficial level, and as he's into older women, he could well have fantasized about her. She seemed to be a very nice, warm, friendly person. He may well have misinterpreted her friendliness for something more. She might have just wanted to be sociable and friendly, and he thought that she wanted to be more than that. And don't forget, she always went on her own, never with a husband. She was happily married to a man in Edinburgh, but she went there to do a walking, so he may have thought that she was looking for love or looking for some relationship.
MacMillan had confronted Helen, he had attacked her, he had trussed her up, he had pushed a bandage in her mouth and taped her mouth closed, and then attempted to rape her. And all the while, as he was doing this, Helen Talbot was suffocating to death on the bandage and the tape.
This poor woman did not die easily, but one of the most curious aspects of it is the covering binding of her head in plastic, probably before she had died, so that whatever else happened, she suffocated as well. And this is not in any sense a good way for someone to go. Now, one of the reasons for this can be, I do not want to look at this person's face to see what I've done. This is a person that I have developed some feelings of love, lust, whatever it is for. I cannot look at them dying. On the other hand, it may also be punishment. Talking of the woman, you've titillated me for years. When the point came that I developed my confidence, you simply turned me away, and I hate that, and look what you've done, and your killing is your fault, and I am punishing you for my pain.
I don't think he would have intended to actually murder her. I think that he thought he would have a sexual encounter which may involve force, and he would easily overcome this elderly lady, but the kind of reality when it presented itself, I think, was very different.
Donald MacMillan Jr. was now faced with finding a way to cover the tracks to his murder before his parents returned. At a remote guest house in the Scottish Highlands, Donald MacMillan Jr. had murdered holidaymaker Helen Talbot. The killer was now focused on finding a way to conceal his crime.
After she was dead, he put a plastic bag over her head, taped that up even more, and then he was faced with a dilemma. What do I do with the body? How do I get rid of the body?
I don't know where he kept it for the weekend, because he couldn't have dug a hole, taken the logs pile down, rebuilt it without his cousin and his wife hearing it, because the night that the murder was committed, they were in the caravan.
We're talking about Scottish Highlands. It's very rock with a bit of soil over it. It's actually quite difficult to dig deep. You need to dig at least 6 foot so that wild animals can't dig up the body. You can't do that where he was, so I think he dug the hole as much as he could, then he covered it with firewood, metal tin and things like that, so as to hide the body.
I think the actual disposition site of the body is one of the puzzles of this case, because there is some care. It has to have been done at home. There's a family at home, there's a grave prepared, the woman is put into the grave, and then it's all covered up with layers of different materials. The element that I struggle with is how and when this was done without any form of observation.
Murderers often will do anything to cover their own backs. They will blame anyone, including the victim themselves. You know, there's kind of this shifting of blame onto the victim because they are so intent on covering their own backs, they don't care whose reputation they trash in the process.
Several days later, when she should have returned home to Glasgow, she didn't. And when she didn't come home, her husband raised the alarm. And the police went to Griannan House, which was the place where she had last been seen.
He said that she'd been picked up by a man in a car and just drove away. He obviously thought she was away climbing, according to him. That's basically it. The car was left behind and she'd gone off with this so-called man.
Donald made it seem that Helen had been having some kind of romantic entanglement with this mystery man, and that on the morning of July the 7th, she had essentially eloped with her lover.
Her belongings were absent from her room, which kind of gave credence to this idea that she had left willingly, that she'd gone off with someone else. So from this, the police didn't kind of worry too much. They thought maybe she had been having an affair and had gone off with another man.
We had our own suspicions of it. It was a murder, a suspected murder, I should say, really. Although we were investigating that, it was still a missing person.
There was nothing to pin him to her disappearance. He acted suspiciously. He was known as a bit of an odd character, and certainly women in the area suspected him of being a peeping Tom and kind of spying on them. But there was no proof that he'd done anything. He was just an oddity.
I know it's easy to say now, but I formed an opinion after speaking to him on 2 occasions while he was very agitated, very defensive for a so-called missing person.
When the police investigate a crime, they have to look as broadly as possible to start with. If they immediately start to focus on just one person within a family setting, and a person who they have no real reason to think ill of, then they're not doing their job properly. I mean, remember, this man is not going anywhere else. There are no other likely women around that he is going to be able to harm. He has given an account of her going away with someone else. He is a local person that they've got no reason to disbelieve him. I don't know what they know about his leaving of the service, but at that stage there is no reason for them to think this woman is dead. I mean, she's left, she's gone away. Lots and lots of people go missing. Most of the people that go missing are not killed. Most of the people who go missing do turn up. And the investigators have to approach this in a very systematic way.
You've got restrictions for taking people in and questioning and that, and with nothing really on him to suspect that he had committed a murder rather than what your own suspicions were. Unfortunately, people were reporting it all over the country, which had to be investigated. But we weren't getting anywhere. There was no evidence in that.
Her husband, when she was missing, got permission to sell the family house. So then suspicions start to arise that, yes, maybe she was having an affair, or maybe her husband had killed her. So you have these factors that kind of cause a bit of confusion over her disappearance as to whether she had met a bad fate or whether she had actually gone off willingly.
One of the worst things about the thing was going down and interviewing her husband. We didn't treat him as a suspect, but you know, the questions we were asking him, obviously, he thought he was a suspect. In fairness to him, he did say, "Look, boys, don't worry about it. I understand you've got to do your job." And that was, you know, a lot straining off us too, because you knew we didn't have it, but you had to ask him.
Donald MacMillan was a suspect for quite a considerable time. The police really thought he was the man, but there was no evidence of it. And he actually complained to the authorities that he was being hassled by the police.
This seemed like a cold case that could not be solved. We had no body, no possessions. However, everything changed kind of almost a year later when a woman visiting her grandmother in the area found Helen's possessions hidden just a matter of metres away from the guest house.
And they were out for a walk on a Sunday afternoon, and as they were walking past Greenish, that's the house where Donald stayed, she spotted a black bag in the gorse and amongst the dead brambles and ferns and that. And for some reason, she insisted in seeing what was in the bag. And eventually she got her father and the uncle to go and take the bag. And when they opened it, lo and behold, they found a rucksack belonging to Mrs. Torbett.
was her purse. There was a bag. There was one slipper. All of these things had belonged to Helen Talbot, who had last been seen 10 months ago. In fact, the only thing that was really missing from her collection of items was a canvas holder, which she took everywhere on these trips. That wasn't under the pile of branches.
That bag that was found in the bushes contained her diary, and there was a wee entry from Mrs. Talbot saying what's Donald up to.
And she wrote in her diary, found a letter from Donald MacMillan. Uncomfortable.
That diary entry happened the night before she was murdered. So obviously all that we had been told by Donald was a complete lot of lies. So that changed things as far as we were concerned in an inquiry. It became, as far as we were, a murder inquiry. If we never had discovered that bag, it would still be an unsolved murder.
I think that a key precipitating fact in this killing is his, if you like, getting up the courage to write an inappropriate letter to her, and her quite reasonable decision to say, no thank you, we've got to put this out of the way. I think that then fractured a relationship from his point of view that had been running for years, and had also put an end, if you like, burst the balloon of the fantasies he had built up about the prospective relationship that they could have.
Donald MacMillan's fantasies would have been fairly crude by comparison to most people's sexual fantasies. His ineptness, his lack of experience in these sexual situations, it would have probably have been very much influenced by pornography. What he thought was actually what you should do, what should be arousing. And I really don't want to think about what went on in Donald's mind.
A lot of things come out about Donald during that month, which locals knew about, but obviously hadn't said. They did start speaking, but it was all, again, supposition. A creepy sort of chap who'd be out at night.
What the police found was evidence, clear evidence, that he had a series of sexual fetishes. Some of these were fairly low level. He wore women's underwear under his work clothes. He had taken to becoming a peeping Tom, a voyeur. This is a classic sign of an early level sex offender.
He couldn't really relate to people normally, so he had these perverse ways of gratifying himself, which would have been signals out there in public to say, you could be a problem.
Maybe Donald was living out some sort of fantasy in terms of his offending, in terms of his behaviour. He's this loner, kind of living in a caravan in his 30s, kind of thinking about women's underwear, kind of thinking about his female neighbours, suggests an inability to make meaningful relationships with women, because he's fantasizing about the idea of relationship with an older woman, and eventually those fantasies become kind of obsessive and he needs to carry them out. There was evidence that Donald had sexual issues, that he was stealing women's underwear, that he was spying on female neighbours. But there's a huge gap between that and killing someone or causing their disappearance.
When we were searching his caravan, we found quite a few pornographic magazines. The naked women that all had figures against them, like 5, 10, 20. And the ones that had the highest, we looked at it as a sort of ones he liked or not. Ones with the highest numbers were elderly ladies.
Donald MacMillan was fixated, had a sexual fixation on older women, and at some point during the years that she had been staying at Griannan House, MacMillan had fixated on Helen Talbot.
Donald MacMillan could be described as a gentrophile, basically meaning that he had a kind of preference for older ladies. Now, this doesn't mean that he just kind of fancied the odd older person. Being older was a primary requirement for any kind of sexual feeling.
Now the police knew this wasn't a missing persons case. This is a murder inquiry. And all leads point back to Griannan House, the place where she'd last been seen alive.
We got a very good warrant to make us search, pull up floorboards and everything, and we organised a particular day to go to the house with a search team and to take Donald in for interview. He was talkative, quite talkative to a certain extent. Any questions you would make about Mrs. Talbot, he was very defensive, which makes you very suspicious.
The problem, if you've got this gap between somebody going missing and kind of the investigation kicking up a gear, is that when you come to search the property, things might have changed in it. And of course, with the guest house, there had been redecoration, recarpeting, so any forensic evidence that might once have been there now isn't.
So in this case, even though there have been changes and renovations to her home, that doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't forensic traces that we can still find. So for example, we can use a chemical called luminol, which reveals traces of blood that might be caught in the nooks and crannies of a building. So we can peel back carpet and look at the gaps between floorboards. We can examine the grout between the bathroom tiles. And these areas are places where material such as blood can be retained even though there have been attempts to clean or to mask or to change the surfaces. There are still opportunities available, and those things might provide us with a partial picture of what was in place at the time of the assault, but they're still significant because they can lead very strongly towards the investigation into a crime.
All day, the police searched the house. They even unblocked old fireplaces, looking for some evidence.
After a couple of hours, we had to make a decision because he was wanting away. So we actually decided to take him home. Took him home and dropped him off. And lo and behold, about half an hour after we arrived there, the search team had taken up floorboards in the toilet and come out smiling, saying, "The spotted bags."
Underneath the floorboards, they found a canvas holdall, and on the handles of that holdall, Helen Talbot's name had been printed. Now they knew this was where Helen had died.
He was detained. In Scotland is detained, and we had 8 hours then to interview before making a decision to arrest him and charge him.
Donald had quite a period of time where he could have got rid of all Helen's possessions, and he didn't. And the fact that he chose to keep all these items close by really says something about him, and says not only that he wants to keep souvenirs of the death, of what he's done, close to hand, it's also this continued obsession with Helen, even after she's dead, that he wants to keep her close to him.
Why did he bury some of her items but keep others? Why did he keep the bag? Why did he move the body? This is not rational if you look at it from above. What I think you need to do is to understand the pathology and what is going on in Donald MacMillan's mind.
I think it is likely that this man was personality disordered to at least a degree. Not everyone who kills is a psychopath. This is an easy label to stick onto things that makes it easier for us. What we're seeing is someone who's relatively isolated, someone who doesn't have a great emotional range, someone who, if you like, invests all of his eggs in one basket and cannot cope when he discovers it's the wrong basket.
Donald MacMillan was a sex killer. Donald MacMillan was on that continuum of sexual offending and was close to the end of it. Murder tends to be close to the top of the cycle of sexual offending. And for men, and it is generally men, who are on that pathway, keeping trophies, holding back something which has belonged to the victim, is an absolutely typical element of the crime.
It's something that he could go and open up any time because nobody else is likely to lift up a floorboard. So we could go there, he could play with it, he could masturbate to it, he could do whatever he wanted. But he's got his trophy from killing. Why do people do it? Because it's a way of keeping the memory alive.
I think it's interesting that the tote bag was kept. Where killings take place and elements are retained, I think it's important to distinguish between what I call trophies and souvenirs. Now, when a killer keeps a souvenir of a victim, of what he's done, he might take, for example, an earring. He might take a tote bag. When a killer takes a trophy, he doesn't take the earring alone, he takes the ear and the earring.
Sexually, he needs to know she's still there, this kind of woman he's been fantasizing about. And in a sense, it doesn't matter whether she's alive or dead. He wants all of this evidence around him to remember her by, to know that it's still present.
At that point, there was no sign of Helen herself. But plainly, Donald MacMillan was the prime suspect. He was arrested and questioned, but he refused to tell them anything. The police realized that it was likely that Helen's body would be somewhere nearby, and they began preparing for an extensive and expensive search of the area. They even brought in ground-penetrating radar.
There are lots of geophysical techniques now that are available that allow us to screen relatively large areas very quickly, such as drone technology and ground-penetrating radar. And so we can use those to screen these areas before we deploy sort of on-the-ground troops who can then do a fingertip search of areas that we've highlighted due to this screening technique. And in this particular case, they actually used helicopters to screen large swathes of land in order to then deploy their ground teams to examine those in more detail.
I would say he thought nobody'd ever find it. I mean, even when the helicopter was rolling, searching round about, Donald was sitting on the log pile where the body was eventually found, speaking to myself. He was quite cocky. He saw the helicopter going over, obviously taking photographs, and he was very detrimental to the police dogs who were sniffing around, saying, "Oh, you boys are not very good, you're not going to find this body."
He would have felt that, I'm here, I know where it is, I'm in control of this situation. But he would push it one stage further, socially ineptly saying things like, "Oh, the dogs will never find her." If she wasn't there, there wouldn't be a body to find. In that, somehow he's actually confessing, but doesn't realise it because he lacks social insight.
When he sat on the body, when the police helicopter went over and everything else, I don't see that as being having a go at the police. I think that's quite good tactics. His body heat would camouflage any identifiable body shape of Helen's some 2-3 feet below him. So I think it was quite a clever move to do that, and the dogs would smell him rather than her body. So again, he could just laugh it off and say, oh well, the dogs are smelling me and I'm not dead yet.
I wonder whether Donald actually got some sort of validation from what he'd done and from knowing that this body was here and people walking past it every day. He's kind of been a failure in so many aspects of his life, but he has kind of got one over on this woman for rejecting him. He's killed her. He's kind of achieved something in a very disturbing kind of way. And so it's validating him knowing that the body is there, knowing what he's done, as well as getting that kind of, I suppose, a sexual frisson from it. Donald had kept quiet about what he'd done for so many months, and when the police tried to get him to confess, he just didn't. And so it was left to his parents, really, to ask him what he'd done and to try and get him to admit to them what he wouldn't admit to the police to.
Donald MacMillan's parents kind of encouraged him to come clean, but oddly enough, of course, Donald's mind didn't work on a kind of clean breast kind of level. It was more a case of configuring some strange kind of logic.
The interviews were basically very difficult. Get anything from him, we got nothing from him. Never ever spoke about Mrs. Torbert or said anything. We stopped the interviewing, he's still there, but we was in having a cup of tea. He, for some reason or other, decided to do a sketch. Did a sketch which was showing a log pile, big long pile, and he put a wee X on it, and basically, he never said it, but basically said that's what she is.
We see a person who doesn't want to be thought ill of. We see a person who's been in trouble, who's finding it difficult. Remember, he's got his parents to cope with, and at this stage, even showing where the body is isn't the same as saying I've killed someone. And I think he's preparing them and himself to go deeper as time goes on.
When they were digging, they were actually, they didn't know, it was a big area. They were digging to the right, the body was just to the left. But by good luck, one of the boys just spotted toes and went left, and sure enough it was. So they eventually found Mrs. Torbert all covered in black plastic bags and taped up.
Even though we've got this time delay, there's a very strong chance that the things that were deposited at the time of her assault would still be available. But obviously we need to be very careful in the way that we recover her remains so that we don't undermine that body of evidence that is still on her and in her surroundings. So the crime scene examination needs to be very methodical, and we need to have a very clear strategy as to how we're going to recover her body and optimise the opportunities for forensic examination.
After her body was found, all the plastic bags and tape and all that were taken for forensic examination. The Identification Bureau boys did a very good job and found a lot of fingerprints which were identified as being Donald MacMillan's.
He had taped up Helen Torbert's face and mouth using sticky tape. And police forensic scientists had taken that tape from her decomposed body and had separated the glue from the tape. And on the tape, they found MacMillan's DNA imprints.
It took 2 months to complete the autopsy on Helen's recovered body. This was, in part, to do with the extensive decomposition of the human remains.
The body was too much deteriorated to prove there was any sexual activity done there. The last time I spoke to him was after the body was found. It wasn't any inquiry, just speaking to him, a cup of tea and that. I don't know if he was taking it in, that what he had done. You know, it's very difficult. But after he went to prison, we didn't speak to him again.
At MacMillan's trial, he stunned everyone when he admitted manslaughter, but denied committing murder.
Once the prosecution evidence was finished, Donald went into the dock to give his evidence, and lo and behold, the first thing was he admitted to strangling Mrs. Torbert. Pat said it was an accident. And everybody just gasped. It was just complete shock, really. It just took us completely by surprise. Couldn't understand what he was going to be, his defence was going to be. But obviously he'd been advised they'll go through there. They were obviously hoping that certain evidence would get dropped. And that one that realised it didn't, he was going to go for a capital homicide rather than murder.
The jury saw through MacMillan's ploy to deny responsibility for the horrific crime and rapidly returned a guilty verdict. He refused to express any remorse for the crime.
Why didn't he show remorse? Maybe because he didn't feel he'd done anything wrong. We get killers who justify what they've done. He may justified his killing her by saying she rejected his advances or whatever, or his approaches to her. It may not even be sexual advances, it might have been just social advances. She's rejected him, he's felt hurt, and therefore he's punished her.
He was somebody who lacked empathy. It's part of his physical design, it's part of his mental makeup, that he actually does not have empathy. He shares this characteristic in common with psychopathic killers, because quite simply they don't feel for the other person either. And although he doesn't share other characteristics with those individuals, he does have the lack of empathy. He doesn't feel that he's done anything wrong.
This was a small community on the side of a loch. It's a peaceful community where you wouldn't expect to find much happening. And when you've got this kind of small, close-knit community, something massive happens and it rents across the community. It really does scar it, because it's a huge event. It's something that nobody understood, nobody guessed what Donald had done. And so it's a member of your own kind of committing such a huge offence. How could you not know? You know, there were concerns about his behaviour, and yet nobody could ever have guessed that he would go to these lengths to satisfy himself.
The interesting question is, could he have been rehabilitated into the community? Unfortunately, we don't know the answer to that, because he died in prison, apparently of a heart attack. I think it would be very difficult because of his age when he came out, because of his lack of social skills, his lack of relationship skills more than social skills. That would have been a handicap. Being in prison, he wouldn't have had the opportunity to develop those with a female, and that's a fundamental flaw of that approach. But he would need a lot of assessment over a long period of time, and slow release through a category C and then category D open prison, and then slowly in the community, and then followed up by what would be probation services in those days.
you always in the back of your mind there was things there, your own mind and that, and you obviously, until you found out she was either missing or, as it turned out, murdered, there's always pressure there, because they're always asking questions and pressure from up above. But things turned out fine. Then you start getting criticism for no finding it sooner, but that's life, isn't it?
This case kind of shows the dangers of assumptions and of rumours. When Helen went missing, people seemed only too willing to believe that she could have gone off with someone else. They were very happy to believe that her husband could have been responsible for her death. And it just shows that we don't really know people. You know, people see the worst in everyone, and they always want this kind of tidy solution. And it's not always what you think, and it's not always the person you think is responsible who can do something like this. Donald MacMillan lied about what he'd done for months, but with Helen's body and her possessions lying so close to home, he must have known that eventually his lies would catch up with him, and they did.